Hi, everybody. My name is Phil Jenkins, and I'm here to talk some philosophy with my friend Jason. Jason will introduce himself in a second. I teach philosophy at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So I like talking about philosophy, and I like talking to my friend Jason here. Jason, you want to say a little about yourself?
Hi, my name is Jason. I am honored to have the opportunity to discuss philosophy with Professor Jenkins. He's helped open up my mind in many ways, and I'm greatly appreciative for that.
Very good. Thank you so much for those kind words, Jason. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little about David Hume, the Scottish philosopher who is known as an epistemological empiricist, and although he would not have called himself that, he wrote on a lot of different things. But what we both read in preparation for talking about Hume today are some comments, an excerpt that he wrote. Actually, I'm sorry, is excerpted from his book, the Treatise on Human Nature, and it's about induction, but he talks specifically about how we get our impressions from the world and then what happens inside of us when we get those impressions. So it really is about psychology. You know, the science of psychology wasn't going on at the time that Hume was writing in the 18th century. And so he was philosophizing about how we know things and how we can know things, which does seem to indicate a little bit about what there really is in the world. And part of this conversation will have to do, or we may come to discuss a little bit about what it has to do for things like science, because cause and effect is very important in our concepts of science and how scientists operate. Cause and effect is very important. So, first of all, what did you think about the reading, Jason?
Yeah.
That's a big question. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think what struck out to me most was his attack upon induction. You know, these are things that I've taken for granted throughout the course of my everyday life. So to give me that moment of pause and to have me stop and question some of the simple cause and effect relationships that I took for granted, I found that intriguing.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, you want to start with some questions that you have there?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, one or two. We could either start with impressions, because Hume spoke a lot about impressions, and then the relation of ideas and matters of fact. That's something that I'd like to clarify.
Good. Okay, so this excerpted part from his book starts out, he talks about that we have two sources of knowledge, really. One, and they're really only different insofar as he says that they're lively. So there are two perceptions, you can kind of say. There are two kinds of perceptions, so ways that we get information from the world. Really, there's only one way we get information from the world directly, and that's from impressions. He calls them impressions. It's when we have sensations that organize themselves into perceptions, and these are lively. Like, it really helps to use an example. So if you see an apple, there's an apple before you on the table. If you when you see it, you touch it, you can smell it, you can tap it. Your experience of that apple is more pronounced. It's more emphasized. It's in his words. It's livelier than the alternative, which is ideas in the mind or thoughts about that apple. So my thought of the apple, my thought of the experience of the apple is less lively than the impression of it. But that's really it. The knowledge that we have is not anything that's innate. We do have a lot of things that are innate. He says a lot of things about human nature that makes it sound like we have, we have mechanisms, we have inbuilt processes that can work. Okay. Whoa, what was that?
That was an old alarm. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. I thought maybe I won something there. The initial feeling, the initial impression that we get from the apple is stronger than the idea that we get later of the same apple. Well, that's really what the way it is with the apple is the way it is with everything. So what that means is that every idea that we have is traceable. Well, it's either traceable to something that really that we really experienced, or it's just some, which is really to say the same thing, it's just some variation on something that we actually experienced. So that's important, because when he goes to talk about matters of fact and relations of ideas, now we're talking about two kinds of things that we can know. So he talked about perception, and he talks about like facts, things that we can know. And there's two kinds of those. There's relations of ideas, which relate to the ideas that he was just talking about, that really are just impressions that we've had before that are mixed and matched and put together in different ways. There's sort of traces or semblances, or you can think of pictures, or recordings, how it's not the same as actually being there. And then matters of fact, but the difference between matters of fact and relations of ideas, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I feel like I'm going to be talking a little too much. And, it's your question. How do you see the difference between matter of fact and relations of ideas, if that's fair to ask you?
That is fair. Well, I thought that for me, from what I extracted, it seemed like matters of fact were, he talks about two types of impressions, but I thought that relations of ideas could be evolved out or pushed out into imagination, and that's what he didn't like. He didn't like, because you could do that. And I distinctly remember him making the statement that he didn't believe in God because there was nothing that could be traced back to that from our senses.
Yeah, and the important thing about saying that that God is really a relation of ideas is that, as you say, it can't be traced back to an impression, not to something that really exists in the world, but it can be thought of as, or it's easily thought of as a variation of sort of impression ideas that we have. So we've experienced goodness. We know what goodness is. We know what profundity is. We know what knowledge is. So our minds can extrapolate and sort of add on to that to come up with a concept of what God is. But if it doesn't have, if we can't point to an impression in the world where that really came from, then there's no grounds for believing that thing that we imagine is really exists.
Now,
yeah. Well, one other thing is that let me just enter this in here, is that matters of fact. With a matter of fact, you the contradiction of a matter of fact is conceivable. And with relations of ideas, a contradiction is not conceivable. I mean, things derived from matters of with relations of ideas that we derive from relations of ideas only are not you can't conceive of the contradiction of it. So so for instance, we put the idea of triangle, a triangle having three sides, or 2 and 2 is 4. We these are concepts that we have whose contradiction just doesn't make sense. They're all necessarily true. But with matters of fact, things that really happen in the world, we can conceive of a contradiction. I mean, even if it's as simple as, well, this apple is there before me, but it's conceivable that the apple in another situation could not be there. I mean, whether the apple is there or not is a matter of fact. Whether the sun rises, or actually the sun doesn't really rise, and he knew that too, but for convenience, we can just call it the sun rising every day. That's not a necessary truth. That's something that is a matter of fact, so we can conceive of the sun not rising.
So then, like we spoke of earlier, so he says that he wants things to be traced back to some sensory impression. So how about the fact that when I have a dream, to me, it's a very similar experience. To me, my body reacts physiologically the same way as it would if I were awake. So does that create any concern? Does he ever address that?
Well, I could ask you to be a little more specific about what kind of concern might that affect. Sure. Yeah.
Because he's resting on the fact that because the impressions from our senses are more vivid or lively, that implies that they're more accurate. There's a strong, or am I mistaken when I'm reading into that?
Okay, so it sounds like this is a similar kind of idea with Descartes, where he says, how do I know whether I'm dreaming or not? I mean, it sure seems like when I'm in dreams that what's happening to me is really happening. And then that's his jumping off point for saying that we really can't depend on our senses to give us knowledge. Okay. I think what he would have to say, what Hume would have to say is that when something happens to us in a dream, were the same thing to happen to us in reality, that would be more, is there a duck? A duck over there? Yeah. Okay. When something happens, in reality, it's stronger. It's just stronger. So if we were to smell a rose in our dream, then he would want to say that if we smelled a rose in reality, that would be stronger. And in fact, everything that happens to us in the dream is linked to impressions that we've had before. They're recombined in different ways. So, the kind of interesting thing here is that for him, imagination, there's nothing new in imagination other than what's recombined. So we've had all the experiences that we have can be recombined in our imagination in a way that makes it seem new. And it is new in its recombination, like we can conceive of big monsters or aliens, or, we can conceive of things we haven't seen as such the way that they are, but every aspect of what we imagine has got to link to what we've actually experienced in the world. So we've seen, you know, I haven't seen a Godzilla in my real life, but I have seen lizards. I have seen things that are big. I have seen things that are loud and that growl, you know, like that. I have seen flashlights, you know, that shoot light rays. And you put all those together and combine them, that's the creativity that our imagination is able to do. But all the elements were stuff that are linked to impressions.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if that addresses I don't know if that really gets at what you're trying to ask about the dream.
No, it does. It does, because the point that I was driving at was rooted in, okay, if Hume was making the claim that certainty, we're looking at the metaphysical part of it, and if we're testing to see what the true nature of reality is, or how we can know it, or, you know, how it can be known, if we're having similar experiences to those that we have in our waking moments, and I know I'm asleep, so therefore that dream, those experiences that I'm having in those dreams, they're fallacious. So I just would think that would be one way to strike down what he's saying about relying on the senses, because they can be misleading. I'll take an anxiety attack, for example, or how about people who have schizophrenia? You know, to them, they're experiencing things that aren't really happening. So I just wonder, because we speak of contradictions, I just wonder how that, you know, they can be misleading.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something?
No, I think I just, you know, quickly about that.
Okay.
I mean, at first glance, it does sound like it runs counter to his claim that all we need to know. I mean, it sounds like all we need to know about what is an impression and what is an idea is that impressions are livelier. But I wonder if we might need to be a little more charitable about what he means, and that is that he's talking about, or that might be that he's talking about a sort of normal operation of the human perceptive organs, so that cases that are like dreaming or people that have hallucinations, which could be far more intense than somebody's ordinary, you know, waking perception. He might have to treat those as sort of outlier cases, because maybe what he wants to, maybe he's trying, I think he may not be trying to say something that's sort of necessarily true for every single person. So it's not like a mathematical proof. It's more like like in psychology, like when psychologists do experiments, they're not trying to make claims that every single person in the world is going to have this experience this way, or is going to have this reaction to this stimuli, to this stimulus. But this is how, it's more like this is how the mechanism operates of the human mind.
Okay. All right. Well, what I was constantly trying to do for me is I had to keep the idea of how can I tie what he's saying, the argument he's making, to being able to understand reality. How do I make it practical? Remember I asked you that before, like some of this stuff is a little outside of the scope of how I live my life every day. So how do I market that to be able to use it? Is there a way, or what is he trying to derive? What meaning or substance does it have for the everyday life, or does it?
Yeah. Just 1 second, if you would.
Sure.
Okay. That seemed like a long pause for us as we handled some technical difficulties, but that's all sorted out now. Now, if you could just remind me of the question, although on the video it's going to seem like it was only a couple of seconds ago, but if you can repeat the question was like, what does this philosophy have to do with us in my real life? How does this have to do with me in my real life?
Well, I was trying to tie it into metaphysics and how we could understand reality, how we can know the truth of reality, or what we can know. I think you framed it, and
Yeah.
how I can apply that. How can I apply that to living my life?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So this is, really Hume's. I mean, what these people were trying to accomplish was a basis for how we could come to know the world at all, and what we could come to know about the world, and not just on the level of individual people, but on the level of the sciences too. So Hume's project was a lot like Descartes'. Descartes was explicitly trying to find some certainty that some sort of logical, absolute certain foundation that science could build on on top of. So yeah. So what? How can we use this? Well, if we think about these different philosophies or these different perspectives as sort of lenses that we put on to see the world in certain ways, or you can think of them as sort of methods to test what it is that we know, not as being absolutely, I mean, like, we don't have to accept someone's full philosophy. We don't have to accept Hume's total philosophy in order to learn from it, in order to even use it to inquire about how we know what we know. But according to this line of reasoning, then any knowledge that we think we have that's not derived from impressions is spurious, is something that we concoct in our minds. So, for instance, whether it's some soul, some kind of fixed soul that each of us has, if there's no actual impression of it anywhere. And in another place, he talks about that as sort of related. Sometimes in anthologies, what we've read is also extended to include what he says on the idea of the soul and the self, what the self could possibly be, which he can't find an impression that relates to that. So therefore, that sort of has to go by the wayside. Certainly God, as we were talking about, is something that he says that he reasons that we can make sense of the concepts about God from our concepts that we do derive from experience. So, people perform good acts, and we can have certain kinds of small levels of knowledge, and if we just, by the use of our mind, just sort of extrapolate that, just sort of rearrange that into something that's really big, huge, kind of like turning something real like a lizard into Godzilla, something that doesn't exist. We can turn the supposed attributes of God into something that in our minds anyway seems to really exist, but doesn't in reality. So there's that. Then with the matters of fact and relations of ideas, what he's going after there is our idea of cause and effect, and specifically the idea that was pervasive at his time. And I think for a lot of people, whether we explicitly think this or not, we tend to think that cause and effect is a relationship that is a logically necessary relationship. I mean, in other words, it's inconceivable that there couldn't be, that there could be anything else but cause and effect. And one way that I use to demonstrate this for students sometimes is I say, suppose that a tennis ball just rolls in the room, right? Just from the door being open, a tennis ball just rolls in the room. And I was to ask somebody, what what did that? What made that ball roll into the room? And if the person said, oh, nothing at all, right? There was no cause to its rolling into the room, then we would think we were faced with a logical contradiction. You know, something that just couldn't possibly be true. Could something happen that was not caused by anything, right? So, and of course, there are arguments for the existence of God, whereby the only thing that could cause something that itself is uncaused is God, and that's why God caused the universe. And but setting that aside, because in these kinds of conversations, we're talking about what's inconceivable. I mean, unless one wanted to say, oh, well, God caused it. But most people would say, that's not how we generally think of causation. I mean, things cause other things to happen. That's just logic. That's just inconceivable that couldn't happen. I mean, for instance, try to imagine something caused out of nothing. I mean, you can imagine that there's a kind of a poof that happens, but it doesn't really make sense. So what Hume's arguing is that that's actually not a logical concept at all. It's not derivable from our relations of ideas. It's derived from experience.
Also, experience generated cause and effect. That's what Hume would say. Again, yeah. that's his springboard.
Yeah. You know, he goes through this chain of reasoning where he says, you know, where does cause and effect come from? And it seems to come from one thing happening and then another thing happening. And those two things seem to be connected. And then we call that connection cause and effect. But what is there really besides those two things happening at the same time? What he calls conjunction, you know, the two things happening, one thing happening and then the other happening. So the two things are constantly conjoined. Whenever I eat bread, it nourishes me, is his one example he uses. From when I'm thirsty, I drink water. That, you know, as long as it's not poison or I'm full, or, you know, if I'm thirsty and I drink water, that nourishes me. When we see, you know, one billiard ball sitting there and another billiard ball going in a certain direction, if there's nothing else happening all around, we just know that the one billiard ball, when it comes up and strikes the other one, that the other one is going to go in a certain trajectory. It's going to go in a certain line. But he says, how do we know that? How do we know? You know, we could watch it 100 times, and what are we really seeing? Are we really seeing cause and effect? Or are we just projecting this idea that one thing causes another, when actually all that we're really seeing is one thing coming up to here and the other thing going over there, right? One thing coming up and touching. Logically speaking, this ball could go off in a completely different direction. I mean, logically speaking, it could just go straight up. It comes and hits, goes through, the other one goes straight up. One billiard ball could come up and this one turns into a chicken. I mean, there's nothing logically contradictory to that. To those ideas. So all cause and effect, all it seems to be is that we have always seen it operate this way, where when objects come up, they tend to, you know, other objects tend to act in a certain way. Every time I drink water, it tends to, if I'm thirsty, it tends to nourish me. And that seems to be based on our belief that the future will be like the past. But then why should we think that? I mean, it's always been that way, that the future has turned out to be like the past. But how do we know that? And it's not a skepticism where he's saying that, hey, stab yourself with a fork because how do you know it may feel good this time? What he's not being so skeptical that that he's saying that that these regularities that we observe in the world can't be counted on. What he's skeptical about is that these are necessary connections, that these are necessary concepts, that these are concepts that are logical in form, that are just like 2 and 2 is 4, and a triangle has to have 3 sides. That it's
a good distinction. That's a good distinction there.
Good, thank you. So we have this idea that the future will be like the past. It doesn't mean that that's a bad belief to have. I mean, it's pretty well grounded, but it's not a logical thing. It's not what he calls, it can't be demonstrated. And in his terms, at that time, it's like it can't be shown by a logical demonstration. There can't be a proof given of it. I mean, the same for all of science, same for the law of gravity. I mean, the law of gravity, and it's not to undermine our confidence in these scientific discoveries about the world. It's just to put what it is that we've discovered into its proper context, into what it actually is, because all of science is, as they say, on all fours with the same thing as the billiard ball. And so it's all probabilistic. It's not absolute. The law, the way our laws of nature act right now are not logically the way that they have to act in the future. They could change in the future. And this is just using this basic observation of really looking. So with a couple of principles, this idea of like, well, everything that I know, everything that we know comes from experience, unless it runs through our relations of ideas where we can have sort of imagination, which is really just a recombination of the things that we experience in the world. So everything we can know about the world is probabilistic, not logically demonstrable. And so he finishes up that whole thought with that the future is like the past. Why do we think that? And then what does he come to finally? The reason that we think the future will be like the past is because it's custom. It's our habit. I think we can't break the habit. It's part of our human nature. It's part of our human nature to get in the custom of things that operate in the same way over a period of time. We tend to think, oh, okay, that's how things are. Whether they really are that way, I mean, one could be really skeptical about it. And Kant, very influenced by Hume, was in a lot of ways skeptical about it. Kant will say later that precisely because of what Hume came up with was the reason why we can't know for sure what the world is like outside of our perceptions of it. So, yeah, so that was sort of the beginning of that whole idea that really changed philosophy and Western thinking in general for, even now, about people's skepticism, even about truth. I mean, the whole fake news and ideas like, well, that's your truth, not my truth. The whole relativism idea, I think, can be traced pretty easily. I mean, it can be traced to before Kant, but I mean, these guys were looking really intensely at human experience and coming up with the idea that this is not a logical connection, according to Hume. It's not something that is necessarily true. It's something that we have a custom, we have a habit of expecting the future to be like the past.
There's a quote that I wrote, and it ties in exactly. with what you said. I'd like to read it for you.
Yeah. Is it in the is it in the in the Hume reading?
Yes.
Because I could actually bring it up. I have the Hume reading here.
Okay. Can you bring it up?
Yeah. Do you know where it is?
I wrote it down, but I believe it was
Oh,
page 6, I think. Let me see.
page 6. Do I have 188, 189?
Oh, okay, okay.
Is this the
Mine
one?
went.
Yours didn't look like this?
It did, but because it was in a zip file, it went by pages 1, 2. But I think
Oh, okay. Well, I could count.
yeah.
I could count that way. You think it was at 6?
Okay. Yes, I believe so.
Do you remember anything about it?
Yeah.
Like some of the words?
Well, I do have it written down. I only have it 2 pages, so it should be right here for me.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to pause the recording a second while you look, okay?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just pausing. Okay, so unfortunately we weren't able to find that particular quote, but do you want to take your interpretation of the quote that you were looking for, or that you actually found, or do you want to read the quote again and we can go from there?
Sure.
Okay, so
Okay.
read it again if you would.
Okay. The matters of fact. No. Okay. What is the nature of evidence which assures real existence?
Yeah.
Okay. What is the nature of evidence which assures real existence beyond present testimony of senses? What excites curiosity, destroys faith, securities, and is the bane of reasoning and free inquiry.
And so that's the question that he asks. Does he answer that question? Because I mean, usually what he does is he'll ask a question like that, and then he'll say what the answer is.
Okay.
What is the, well? I mean, that's kind of, because that's what he's kind of doing when he's going through. What is it about matters of fact that give us grounds to be able to say things that are true, to be able to say what's true and what's not, and it appears to be that they're based on experience, that they have impressions that come from actual experience. Things like cause and effect are based on, our reliance on it as true is based on experience rather than on logical necessity. But really all we have to go on as far as knowledge is based on our experience. Otherwise, we're just sort of stuck in our own minds, which is called solipsism. So, yeah, I have to find that that quote exactly and see what he says right after that. But
I'll remember that. Yeah, I'll remember that. Why I wrote it down and why it stuck out to me so much is because I think that I'm blinded so much by my bias. That free inquiry, the bane of reasoning, is bias. For me, it is. It prevents me from being able to look at things. It prevents me from looking at things in a way that's free. He's right. Like there's a stubbornness in me, Professor, that doesn't wanna move away from anything secure. You know, I like when I read what Hume wrote, I was rebellious.
Mm.
You know what I didn't want to. I don't want anything to jeopardize my sense of reality.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
So and you know, you're right. I should have written down what came right after that because it's pivotal. You're right. That would have helped me really connect with his point.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about what is it about what Hume was saying that is it just the general project of trying to figure out exactly what is real and looking for a method to figure out what true knowledge would consist of? Or is it something about his particular method or his particular categories of how to go about it that felt sort of threatening or uncomfortable?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. You're right. I think it was a little of both, Professor. You're right. It was the method. I'm comfortable with cause and effect. Don't take that from me. You know what I mean? Give me my blanket back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's not taking cause and effect from us. I mean, you know, that could be something that. But I mean, it just depends. I mean, I kind of think, but I think I had the same reaction where it felt profound, like, oh my gosh, he's like he's questioning the very foundations of how we think we know anything at all. On the other hand, I think over time, what you start to realize is like, well, what did I really think cause and effect was anyway? How important is it that I think that it's a necessary relationship, like a logically necessary relationship?
I like the way you illustrated that earlier, Professor, because I never thought about it that way. You're right. He's not taking cause effect away. He's saying that it might not be logically necessary. Is that what you said? I like the way you said it. Right.
Yeah.
Because
most of the things we work with, most of the things we operate with in the world are not logically necessary, but we still, you know, have lots of feelings about them, and we still depend on them. But yeah, it does seem like maybe it's not so much the logically necessary versus contingent idea about cause and effect. Maybe it's just the fact that he is questioning something so basic to what we think we understand about the world. And so that feels uncomfortable. That feels like the ground, like Willard Van Norman Quine, known as Quine in the field, 20th century analytic philosopher. He came up with this way to think of our beliefs as a web. He called it the web of belief. He wrote a book called The Web of Belief. And there are the beliefs in the middle sort of the web are more deeply entrenched to how we operate, who we are, you know, what we think about the world. And then beliefs on the sort of outer edges are beliefs that we could sort of do, we don't depend on as much. You know, they're not as crucial to us. You know, like I don't know, like when I moved to where I live in Scranton, I thought I forgot why I thought this exactly. Maybe somebody told me at one point, yeah, it's a mile from my house to school. And I walked that a few times over the first couple of years. And I thought I was walking a mile, you know, so 2 miles if I went there and back. But then I got a Fitbit, and it tells you how far distance is. And I think it sort of depends a little bit. I don't know. Let's just, anyway, it turns out it wasn't exactly a mile. It was less than a mile. So I was a little shaken. Like, you mean all this time I thought I was walking 2 miles when I would walk there and back, and yet I was walking about more like a little over 1.5 miles or so. Well, but that's a belief that had to change for me, but it wasn't a core belief. It wasn't in the middle of my web of beliefs. So yeah, I remember when that happened, but it didn't change my life a lot. But if I were to find out something like, like maybe I live 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, and I find out that the Earth actually revolves around the sun instead of the other way around. Or now I were to find out that cause and effect isn't what I thought it would be. That seems to be more in the middle, and that would tend to have more of a jarring effect for us. About that. I think it's comforting that a lot of people seem to like this idea that beliefs are just something that we all have, that we all decide our own beliefs, that anybody's beliefs are okay. And I think what they're, and that it's okay that your beliefs are different than my beliefs. I think that the way that we're talking is different. I think what a lot of people think of when they think of beliefs is their sort of model for that is belief in God, right? Or belief in the doctrines of some religion. And so if that's the model, then it's easy to think, well, you can believe that your God is this way, and I can believe that my God is that way, and that this is what God wants me to do, and you can think what God wants you to do. And it's become really easy to think that everyone can think what they want about their beliefs, but there's a difficulty with that because beliefs isn't just about God and religious concerns. It's about everything. I mean, our whole connection to the world is connected by our beliefs. I mean, our beliefs are really nothing more, are they not, than just what we think is true. What we think is true in the world is just another way of saying what our beliefs are. And if people are walking around that really think that there is no truth, that everybody's got their own truth, I think, number one, that's kind of unfortunate. And number two, I think it has to be incorrect, because we can say whatever we want to, you and I, to each other. But once we leave here, we don't believe different things about gravity. We don't believe that we can jump off the top of a building and we can fly. We have many of the same. I mean, we have many of the same moral beliefs. I mean, you and I are not going to walk out and, beat up somebody or drive our car into a bunch of kids or something and think that it was a good thing. I mean, most people believe the same things. I mean, the exact same things. I mean, if you take the web of belief as being all of one's beliefs, then it's only the top, maybe 100 or so, or 75 or so, out of thousands of beliefs that we have that might be different from person to person.
Good point.
So yeah, so the core beliefs, the ones at the foundation, or the ones in the core of that web of beliefs, to have those thought of as, to question those, it feels jarring. But
can you pause here a second?
Yeah.
Pause. I want to say something.
Yeah. Let me pause. Hold on. Okay, so so anyway, just to finish that one little thought. So the beliefs at the core, if they make us feel uncomfortable, then that's really to be expected, because I think we are all connected with most of our beliefs. We are more interconnected than we think we are. But that maybe that goes on to a lot of other things that we can talk about in another session. So let's wrap it up now. Thank you so much, Jason, for talking with me. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, and goodbye, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you around. Bye-bye.